Hello, Patreon members. I wanted to go over disaster recovery in detail for this video. And the planning capitals or aspects that I'm about to go over, they come out of work done in Australia for Indigenous communities following their bushfires. However, I don't see these capitals as just recovery capitals. I mean, they are there to guide disaster recovery because I think what happens is communities and organizations don't typically plan for recovery. They're usually caught in this cycle of response and then trying to plan a recovery, days or weeks after the response, which is the wrong time to do it. So these capitals were developed as a way to guide communities during a time of trauma, during a time of crisis, so they could have steps and reminders for a holistic recovery. But as we get more sophisticated in our preparedness and we start to include recovery, I like to incorporate these capitals across all EM planning. And if your community has additions to what I'm about to show you, that's great. Share in the comments about that. But this is going to be a really good start. And grab your pen and paper because there's going to be some things to write down. And there's going to be, some tips given that will help you structure this in a way that you can build it into your everyday work. Like, this is not a one-off kind of process. These are considerations that and a way of working that you can incorporate across the board every day in your job. And just a quick story, what I did for a major disaster recovery of the First Nation was, I got the evacuation and fire happened like the first week of May. I got to the community on the May long weekend, and I think it was probably the first week of June. Oh, hang on a second. I had a notebook where these 7 capitals each had their own section. And I had lists and lists of open-ended questions that I would ask for each consideration. And as I was talking with people, as I was talking to chief and council, as I was listening to conversations, attending meetings, talking to members, talking to rights holders, stakeholders, elders, youth, I would always collect what I was hearing and I would lump it into one of these 7 categories. And then if I found that I wasn't getting some bits of information, I would have questions on hand and say, hey, what do you think about this in a natural term or a cultural setting or a social setting? And that's how I collected data and information for the recovery plan. And that data just got built up in my notes, transcribed, categorized, and we were able to bring forward to the community, months and months of data collection that said, here's what we've been hearing. Does this seem to make sense? Does the community agree with these things? So that is something that I would do as an emergency manager in a community starting today. And I'm going to go through these in specific. So the human side of disaster, we can't forget that because we always put so much emphasis on infrastructure. But we need to focus on what makes us human. What makes an emergency management team or recovery team or a nation team and staff capable and confident, right? What do we need to do within our control, our coordination to, build up skills of other people in the community that would help us during a response and recovery or for preparedness. So some of the things that you can do in this human capital is talk to other managers and find out what they're doing to assess their staff or team and their needs. Maybe the nation has undertaken some strategic organizational development work through human resources to identify skills and deficiencies that the nation is looking to hire or bring in, because those are all indicators and clues of what deficiencies the nation's going to experience during a disaster. What skill sets are underutilized in a community, and how can the nation work towards you know identifying those skills across all of the people? Like, we've seen in so many disasters that trades, nations have so many plumbers and woodworkers and framers and operators, but if they don't have a good sense of those people as assets and those skills as assets, you don't want to be caught off in a response trying to like develop lists of all of these contacts and people on and what they can do. So take that work on now and really focus on your human assets in a recovery. The built area, I mean, this is kind of a no-brainer, right? This is where communities spend so much time on. This is where a lot of the funding from Indigenous Services Canada and other grant programs focus on, whether it's critical infrastructure mitigation or just trying to build better, even building back better after a disaster. There's a lot of emphasis put on, the structure of the home, the trying to make it more fireproof, tin roofing, fiber cement board. What can nations do to, rebuild homes where elders can age in place rather than having to go to an elders lodge or leave the community for long-term care? So I usually don't spend too much time on the built side of things because it's very well understood and there's a lot more resources and it's always considered. Political. So emergency management is political, right? There's a governance model involved in emergency management. Chief and council, senior leadership are involved. They'll work with ministers and MPs, and there's that level. There's also internal politics between families and members and staff. And politics will influence priorities and decisions and budgeting. So you can't ignore the politics when you're planning for a response and a recovery, because you've got to identify the major political influence nodes in a community. Who on council really influences the group? What staff or managers have an ear to the ground where they're receiving a lot of detailed information from members and family and elders? And you want to figure out where those power thresholds are, because if, as an emergency manager, if you can sort of tap into that and use the politics to your benefit to identify and get priorities on the agenda, influence decisions for the better of the community, you want to focus on that. And you want to be strategic as well in terms of how you communicate with the crown. You want to use media, traditional media, social media, and chief and council strategically to get the ear of the ISK minister and assistant deputy ministers and deputy ministers, because there's a lot of leverage there. If the recovery is big enough, send a delegation to Ottawa. Have a plan prepared that at the right time, because politics is all about timing, You'll send chief and council and some staff to Ottawa to have face-to-face meetings if this is critical, if this is a critical event. It is nice to have Ottawa and representatives come to the community to tour, and they will do that if they're invited, and it's very important for them to get that context. But when they go back to work, when they go back to their comfortable lives back in Ottawa or back in any major center, that motivation and that feelings and those observations that they had in community will wear off, especially as they get back to the daily grind of their work, the influence of their leaders and their policy and their staff. And you want to keep those in-person touch points. So going to Ottawa can sort of reinforce that need to keep them engaged, committed to what they promised or said that they would do in community. And, you can use that all to your advantage. Social aspects of disaster. I think within Indigenous worldviews, this is always considered the social fabric of a community. I think is always a consideration. It's not so much in non-Indigenous communities, but again, it's going back into the politics side of things. And who are the groups and the families and the networks within the community that have power or privilege, because their likelihood of getting what they need to recover quickly is higher than maybe for a family that doesn't have that same access to CNC or doesn't have that same privilege, or is maybe seen in the community as a family that, maybe they've got a lot of youth in the family that deal drugs or have a history of violence, and they've kind of been, outed a little bit. But during a disaster, everyone deserves respect and support and help. So and the other thing I'll say too is, that I noticed during a disaster is people will come together. Relationship barriers and walls will break down a little bit. The community will bond during a major disaster. But the risk is those barriers will also redevelop after time, and those old habits and old relationships will get back to the way they were. So creating social events, having ceremonies, whatever it is in your community that might be undertaken to bring people together, it's really important that you use those opportunities to create strong social bonds and continue them. And maybe somehow even try to monitor when, old bad habits are starting to slip in place, right? You want to get that feedback continually. So if, you've noticed that people were coming together for this event and now you're starting to see maybe people or families not show up, what's going on, what's changed, try and re-engage, bring them back together to try and keep things moving forward in a good, positive way. So lots, I'll put in a lot of the considerations that you can ask for these in the post. Culture, super important. You cannot ignore the culture of the community and the people and the values. You want to do work early on to evaluate those, because those are strengths. And if you can sort of show the community, show staff and leadership that the shared values and beliefs and norms and traditions and the language of your people play a role into resilience and recovery and the work and setting priorities and making decisions, the more awareness you can bring around to that, you'll make quicker decisions. You will get consensus more quickly. across all of your projects that you're trying to implement. If you can tie back certain initiatives and projects to shared values and beliefs and traditions and norms of the community, you're going to get buy-in more quickly from members and elders and youth. So even though you might know the culture of your community, or you might know the culture of your people, or you think you know the values, if there hasn't been some work done to identify those maybe within the last decade and formally bring some awareness to those, it's a good exercise to undertake in emergency management planning, because the goal again is to make good quick decisions. And if you can understand the culture, you're going to develop strategies and operational procedures and tactics that are in line with that, and you're going to get a lot more buy-in. So focusing on culture is super critical. And I'll preface a lot of this by saying that you want to make sure that when you're doing this work, you're putting out considerations for people. These are not things that you shall do or you have to look at, because every community is different. But I'll give you some examples. So under culture, something I like to ask groups is, how can recovery be enhanced by listening to elders and youth and families, their experience, to sort of, get that deep knowledge of resilience, healing, and how to live within the community. The people are going to have a whole host of ideas. Asking people what diversity means to the recovery and how is that going to be a strength, that kind of falls under this idea of inclusivity. Really great question I like to ask within culture to make sure that you can sort of de-risk some of the issues that can come up is, like, what attitudes or maybe what topics are taboo or would fall within a stigma that exist within the community that might affect the recovery. You want to consider these stigmas or taboo areas, because if it's not going to be talked about or it's not going to be dealt with, and maybe it has to deal with alcoholism or drug addiction, maybe there's still some stigma in your community about what alcoholism is, and if that exists, then it's not going to serve evacuees well, or those who don't have a home to go back to because it's burned down or flooded. How can you support and provide programming for them? Some other considerations, around restoring like local features, I'll call them, that enable to connect, allow people to connect. So maybe an area where you have a powwow or an outdoor camp or tea dances or whatever it may be. Maybe those were damaged or, can't be used for a couple of years. So, how do you want to redesign those local features? Where can you move those events to kind of make sure that those things don't stop in the community? Those are the kind of considerations I'm talking about. And I'll put some more examples in the post, so you can just kind of copy and paste them as we go along, because I don't probably writing all this down it can be a lot. Natural, super important, of course, to Indigenous communities. There's so many considerations following a disaster where there can be great impacts on medicines, on food sources, on water, right? We've seen landslides that have cut fishing stocks in half in BC. We've seen areas on reserve areas where there's been wildfire, and we've measured the impact to the soil that was superheated, and we know that some medicines aren't going to grow back there for many, many years or without human intervention. Rivers, right? With all of the dams that are being built in BC for BC Hydro, they're having effects on food sources. So the natural aspect of recovery can't be ignored. I think First Nations um, have so much knowledge and expertise and wisdom in this area. I think that they could look at the natural land as, forest around them, whatever it is that's around them. I think they could look at that in the context of emergency management and disaster recovery, and through the recovery process, get funding and support from the government that would advance a lot of really good work in this area. One example would be during a wildfire is, fire smarting, thinning out dead trees and things around homes while there's money in place to deal with danger trees or hazard trees that were maybe damaged during the fire. During a flood, maybe taking a look at what improvements could be made during recovery in ways of adding riprap or whatever to the community, the riverbanks, to reduce erosion for the future. Um, Landslides as well. Using that as an opportunity to look at how, I mean, you can do geological studies or slope stability studies, but just trying to understand the hazards and risks around the community with those. So if there is an earthquake, especially if you're in BC, that you've got some foresight into what could be impacted. Like there's so much you can do. The natural aspect has to be considered, and it's got to be budgeted for and planned for. Some other examples, like one community I worked with, we did extensive uh, GIS work to map out the soil condition following a wildfire during the first summer of that wildfire, and then in the second year and the third year, so we could identify where vegetation would come back quickly or not so quickly. And that gave some good insight for hunters and people that wanted to rebuild their cabins. So lots of considerations there. And yeah, lastly, um, the finance piece. Like this is huge, right? You can't recover without money. And where I often see so many communities having a hard time is scaling up their financial processes and systems to deal with disaster recovery and response expenses, especially if it's a major recovery, talking hundreds of millions of dollars, because chances are the finance team and staff and systems you have, they manage day-to-day operations quite well. But when you have a 50 to 80 to $100 million recovery, with maybe 40, 50 million also in response costs, the paperwork and the receipts and the invoices and the financial management that's needed to manage all of that increases. So you've got to bring in extra people. And depending on your financial system, how rudimentary is it? So, that's one area where you can plan for, making sure that if you do have insurance anywhere within the nation, who's, assessing the policy year over year. What is insured? Uh, what is insured in correlation to the risks in your community? So you kind of want to look at all of that. You want to look at even the income of the nation through economic development or grants or whatever, because without a doubt, if you have a major recovery, you're going to have to fund expenses up front at some point. Yes, EMAP ISK will give advances, But if you're in a $800 million recovery, those advances are only going to get you through the first 3, 4, 5 months. ISK does not bring in extra resources and people to process EMAP reimbursements. So if you're in a ISK region that only has 4 or 5 staff, and your region suddenly has 6 nations submitting EMAP claims, ISK isn't bringing in any more people. And they're certainly not bringing any more people in Ottawa to support the region. So you as a nation have to augment that financial processes, which means training, hiring, more office space, more desks, another manager if your staff really increases. It's getting human resources on board to understand that you need job descriptions and the funding is available to scale up, right? You need them on board as well. So that falls in, HR falls in kind of the human side of things, but on the financial side, absolutely a big, a major consideration. So that is a taste of, a holistic view of planning around many aspects of a community or an organization. And if you need further support on any of this, please reach out anytime. I'd leave some comments. I'd love to hear what you think about this. There are a lot of resources out there, but having gone through this process now with several communities in preparedness and recovery over the last 15 years, you can get to a system of this type of planning rather quickly if you've got some mentorship and some support there, especially because a lot of the work just comes in trying to understand how to navigate the governance and how to get the data and information. I think I hit the pause button there for a second. Hopefully it wasn't on very long, but yeah, let me know what you think of this. And again, we're always here to help. Take care. Thanks for joining us at Hazardscape. You can subscribe to our YouTube and find our ad-free training videos by becoming a supporter on Patreon with a network of other Indigenous peoples looking to make their communities safer. And remember, know your hazardscape and be prepared.